was based on military strength. We know this because his revolt succeeded, as well as from the historian Manetho, who records that the new king, here called Acthoes, was more cruel than all his predecessors, and visited the whole of Egypt with dire disasters. Not exactly a glowing horde, but then Keti was clearly coloring outside the lines. The situation in Keti's time was novel in several respects. 1,000 years earlier, almost precisely, Egypt had first become united under a legendary figure named Narmer. The unification was the end result of a process spanning centuries, the details of which I'll cover more next episode. But the foundation of the Pharaonic state is clearly linked to Narmer, who, on his famous palette, is the first to wear the distinctive crowns of Upper and Low Egypt. Fueled by the vital force of the Nile, 1,000 years of history unfolded. The kings who oversaw Egypt's rise.
I was going to record. Oh, fuck it. Let's let it go.
It's held power over life and afterlife, erasing the distinction between ruler and divine. The development of hieroglyphic writing allowed the Egyptians to record their lives, from minor transactions to major expeditions to vivid descriptions of royal festivals marking dynastic milestones. The advances were paralleled in the visual arts, as reliefs and statues of kings and gods grew ever more magnificent. The ultimate expressions of this early age were Egyptian royal tombs, whose scale, precision, and logistical feats are jaw-dropping even today. Credit for the first Egyptian pyramid is shared between two men. The first was a royal vizier, high priest, treasurer, administrator, architect, and sculptor. Those are his record titles, named Imhotep. The second was his lord, the 27th century BC pharaoh Djoser. Inspiration and innovation took the common form of the royal tomb, the slung rectangular mastaba, and stacked 6 on top of another, each smaller than the last. The step pyramid that created was a defining Egyptian milestone. All that remained was to perfect the form and enhance its size and complexity. The Great Pyramids of Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure mark the apex of the Egyptian Old Kingdom. Later Old Kingdom pharaohs stamped the land with great sun temples and towering obelisks, but pyramids remain the tombs of kings. And equally important, kings remained both sole guarantors of the Egyptian afterlife and font of temporal authority. Until the man who made the change, the pharaoh Djedkare Isesi. In a break with his royal predecessors, Djedkare Isesi distanced himself from claims of divine authority. During his reign, the texts, hymns, prayers, and spells needed to attain the afterlife were no longer reserved exclusively for royal use. At the same time, the king evolved his temporal powers beyond the royal house to both a series of powerful viziers and the rulers of various nomes. He encouraged each province to govern itself, provide for itself, to itself. A bold prescription for an ancient state defined by kingly authority. Pharaonic power diminished further under his successors. First his son, then, after some disturbance, a new royal dynasty in Memphis. Viziers began to fill the gap, wielding power and building tombs of near pharaonic scale. Meanwhile, wealth once diverted to the royal treasury remained in the hands of nomarchs. To these local rulers, freedom from paying royal tithes meant more resources to keep at home, enhancing local prosperity. But to those inclined toward traditional rule, developments reflected the breakdown of Ma'at, the harmony and stability that joined the Nile in giving life to the kingdom. All have seeded the fertile ground for Keti's elevation. The powers he marshaled were a potent mix: military strength and royal legitimacy, the conjured ties to a former dynasty, some degree of personal charisma, and the proffered rule of a local king in touch with local needs. And before too long, Keti began to extend his influence beyond his native Nome. He had some success in Lower Egypt. One of his heirs would capture Memphis, but his southern ambitions were constantly checked by the rival of Thebes, which left things in a curious state. For the first time since Narmer, 1,000 years into rival centers. A fascinating and complex era called the First Intermediate Period. Most details of Keti's reign are lost, but we're very lucky to have the records of one of his closest allies, a nomarch of the province of Asyut who also called himself Keti. Asyut lay at the volatile frontier between Hennesut and Thebes, and Keti the nomarch had been given the role of tip of the spear and defensive shield by the newly ascendant dynasty. In a tomb unearthed by Napoleon's troops, inscriptions relate the life of Keti, servant of the pharaoh Keti I. The nomarch introduces himself as one wiser than magnates, whose hearts are rash, one whom Ptah created so as to command, one to be remembered on earth. Which, based on today's episode, is kind of mission accomplished. He also engages in a bit of name dropping, claiming to have received swimming instruction together with the royal children, and be considered a pupil of the king. His ties were apparently more than bluster, as Keti's family served the dynasty for 2 more generations. One thing shining through the text is the conspicuous pride that Keti took in helping his people prosper. He boasts of constructing new irrigation works without the use of forced labor, of making the workman an eater of northern barley, and of giving out water rations at midday to let the weary recover. He also speaks of abolishing taxes and of filling the local pastures with dappled cattle. Considering his frontier posting, Keti also devotes some time to stressing his military prowess. I am one strong of bow, mighty with his arm, one feared by his neighbors. I formed a troop of spearmen, a troop of bowmen, the best 1,000 of Upper Egypt. He also boasts of a fine Nile fleet and describes himself as alert to danger and calm in time of distress. In addition to sporadic conflict with Thebes, Keti confronted another danger more subtle and more widespread. His inscriptions begin to suggest its contours. I made a sluiceway for this town while Upper Egypt was in a bad way, no water to be seen. I sealed the borders. I made the high ground into marshland. I made the inundation flood the old mounds. I let the plowlands be inundated while every neighborhood thirsted. Everyone had inundation to his heart's content, and I gave water to his neighbors so that he should be at peace with them. In another passage, Keti claims to be rich in northern barley, while the land is in drought. Lack of water, border incursions, and rising local conflict. A crisis ameliorated to some degree by Keti's interventions. But what was the source of the drought? Well, the Egyptians measured the height of the Nile, and those records, correlated with historical texts and modern archaeology, suggest a period of low Nile floods that lasted for nearly a century. Arid conditions around this time are also reflected in desert core samples, which track the relentless encroachments of dunes into the previously lush Nile Valley. As a result, cultivated land was greatly reduced, even as local villages and ancient monuments were slowly covered in sand. Much like the First Intermediate Period, this process also has a clinical name: the 4.2 kiloyear before present aridification event, which basically translates to that time when things got really dry around 4,200 years ago. i.e. around 2200 BC. Go forward, I'll abbreviate it as the aridification event. One interesting thing about the event is that it wasn't confined to Egypt. Research suggests a widespread impact, with increasing aridity across North Africa, the Near East, the Arabian Peninsula, the Indian subcontinent, Central Asia, and the Pontic-Caspian steppe. In fact, based on the maximum interpretation of the current data, the event is a worldwide phenomenon. Which is why I've decided to make this event and its widespread civilization-spanning impacts the centerpiece of this new series. This first season will set things up by covering the history, cultures, and major developments up through around 2200 BC in the region I'll be calling Southwest Eurasia. To get a better handle on the geographic extent, take a look at a map of the Achaemenid Persian Empire at its height. Those are basically the territories I'll be focusing on. In Season 2, we'll unleash the full force of the aridification event and watch its impact on all these cultures over the following 2 centuries. Subsequent seasons will focus on the regional aftermath and the gradual establishment of a status quo over the remainder of the Middle Bronze Age. It's a lot. It's going to be a lot of work. It's also going to be a lot of fun. So I hope you'll hang in there with me to watch it all unfold. The aridification event is sometimes blamed for ending the Egyptian Old Kingdom. And while that's a bit simplistic, it was a contributing factor. Less water and less farmland, a population driven closer to the Nile, and an influx of refugees from marginal territories had basically grown unlivable. It's easy to see how desperate people might turn toward local rulers who offered care and protection in exchange for loyalty and service, which is an undertone that imbues the story of Keti the Nomarch, as well as that of his patron and namesake, the pharaoh Keti I Meriyabtawi. Despite his role in splitting the kingdom, the pharaoh Keti remains a cryptic figure. No tombs or monuments mark his reign, and just a few scattered items, a brazier, a wand, a casket fragment, preserve the royal titles. Only Manetho records his significance, that he founded a new ruling dynasty and visited the whole of Egypt with dire disasters. The author was also generous enough to provide us a fitting end. After tormenting the subjects of his newly formed kingdom, Keti was eventually seized with madness and finally devoured by a crocodile. Even as the pharaoh Keti seized power, the first true empire of the ancient world was on the verge of collapse. After controlling territories from the Mediterranean Sea to the Persian Gulf, and projecting power as far afield as Iran, Oman, and Anatolia, the Akkadian Empire was reduced to a few key cities, primarily Kish and Akkad. It still had a king, Shu-Duru the Mighty, king of Akkad, but he was just one of many kings in a rapidly fracturing land. The vital force of Mesopotamia in modern Iraq has always been its main rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. The floodplain along and between the rivers, fertile soil, and vast agricultural potential. But there was also one major catch. Unlike the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates didn't have seasonal highs and lows that were super well correlated with the planting and harvesting seasons. Which meant that before the locals could grow their crops, they had to take an active hand in trying to tame the rivers. Per Mark van de Meerup, this meant developing a system of canals and storage basins to control the water and allow it to enter fields only when needed. These irrigation techniques were first refined in peripheral locations, northern Mesopotamia, the foothills of the Zagros Mountains to the east, and on the edge of the southern marshes, before being used in the highly productive, flat, and flood-prone plains of southern Mesopotamia. It was only around 5500 BC that this area was permanently settled by a people known archaeologically as the Ubayyads. In addition to the bounteous actual yield, the nearby steppe fed flocks of sheep, and the southern marshland was abundant with fish and fowl. So the southern Ubayyads had the basic ingredients for living a pretty sweet life. And just to flag it, though we are discussing the region of Sumer, we are not yet talking about Sumerians. The southern Ubayyads lived concurrently with another northern culture, the Halaf. The Halaf had started off as central Zagros Mountains before spreading west across northern Mesopotamia to approach the Mediterranean. So basically the extent of the later Neo-Assyrian Empire. In addition to their beautifully decorated pottery, one interesting aspect of the Halaf culture was its use of holos or beehive-shaped houses, similar to ones I saw around a decade ago in the Turkish-Syrian border city of Haran. So, there's cultural continuity, and then there's cultural continuity. Around 4500 BC, for reasons that aren't well understood, Ubayyad culture subsumed the Halaf, making it the dominant culture in all of Mesopotamia. Per Samuel Noah Kramer, the Ubayyads put their stamp on the region in one pretty enduring way. The later Sumerian terms for the Tigris and Euphrates, as well as the city names of Eridu, Ur, Larsa, Isin, Adab, Kulab, Lagash, Nippur, and Kish, are not Sumerian words, which means that both the rivers and cities, or rather the villages that later became cities, were named by people living in the region before the Sumerians arrived. What was Ubayyad culture like? Well, we know from archaeological remains that the Ubayyads were the region's first farmers, cattle raisers, and fishermen, as well as its first weavers, leather workers, carpenters, smiths, potters, and masons. Their settlements were mainly clustered along the Euphrates and its tributaries, and they interacted with one another mainly by water. Most distinctively, we know that most Ubayyad villages grew up around a temple. These temples may have had somewhat practical origins. In contrast to Egypt, governed by the metronome of the yearly Nile flood, southern Mesopotamia's environment was much chaotic. Most significantly, river courses would often shift, destroying crops, canals, and villages. And it's no surprise the region's the setting of the earliest versions of the flood myth. The Ubayyad response was to raise elevated buildings of solid mud brick that could better withstand the floods. Over time, these temples became not only the site of sacred rituals, but also the hub of each city's economic activities. The centrality of the temple to Ubayyad and later Sumerian culture is hard to overstate. As Gwendolyn Lake notes, in the later Mesopotamian creation myth, the Enuma Elish, the first building created by the gods is a temple, raised on a patch of dry land emerging from the waters. Only then is mankind created to give service to the gods and their temples. The temple was an island of stability in a world of chaos, both figuratively and occasionally literally. Which brings us to one of the earliest known Ubayyad settlements, the legendary city Eridu. Eridu was located on the lower Euphrates, close to the Persian Gulf. It later gained a reputation as the oldest city in Mesopotamia, and one of the very few to have survived the Great Flood. Whether or not it's the oldest city, Eridu is certainly very old, with settlement layers going back to around 5400 BC. Eridu's temple, the Apsu, was dedicated to Enki, who, as I noted in my very first episode, was the Mesopotamian god of freshwater, male fertility, and knowledge, which is still a fun combination. According to Lake, at the Apsu's lowest level, on a dune of clean sand, archaeologists discovered the very first building, a primitive chapel no larger than 3 meters square, dating all the way back to 4900 BC. Excavations revealed at least 18 superimposed mud temples between this initial chapel and the incomplete ziggurat of the 21st century BC dynast Amar-Sin, which means it was rebuilt on the exact same spot for nearly 3,000 years. With each iteration, the footprint and complexity of Ares' temple continued to grow, often dramatically. Certain core aspects, including the leveling of each previous building to create a higher platform for the next, strict alignment with the original foundations, and the burying of votive donations, became hallmarks of older Mesopotamian temple construction. For reasons unknown, in the early 4th millennium BC, the city of Eridu underwent some sort of decline. Excavators suggest that after this time, it stopped being a typical self-sustaining Mesopotamian city and endured primarily as a cultic site. Taking the handoff in cultural sense was the nearby city of Uruk, the famous city of King Gilgamesh and his mighty, mighty walls. Only neither one quite yet. And we'll get into a discussion of Uruk right after this short break.
Alaska Airlines and Hawaiian Airlines have come
Introduced the drastically Uruk was an Ubaid era foundation, and excavations performed at Uruk found Ubaid period remains. But the levels above them, from the 4th millennium CE onward, showed evidence of a drastically different culture, one of which Uruk was found to be a major center. Which is why this new archaeological era, beginning around 4000 BC, became known as the Uruk period. One element possibly driving the transition was a growing Semitic influence. The northern, western, and southern frontiers of Mesopotamia were home to Semitic-speaking peoples. Per Kramer, as the Ubaid settlers prospered and thrived, by Semitic tribes started immigrating. We mainly know this through inference. The presence of Semitic loanwords in early Sumerian inscriptions, and perhaps most tellingly, the fact that the earliest known Mesopotamian dynasty whose existence can be historically attested, the so-called First Dynasty of Kish, begins with a group of rulers bearing Semitic names. Kramer proposes that it was the fusion of these cultures, Ubaid and Semitic, that a major cultural flowering. And what was the nature of this cultural flowering? Well, archaeologically, it was revealed in a new set of forms. Going from tiny to huge, the new forms were silver seals, inscribed clay tablets, mass-produced beveled bowls, and new types of monumental architecture. All of announced the advent of what's called the redistributive temple economy. Though still considered dwellings of the gods, temples were redesigned to function as industrial production centers, filled to the brim with workers' workshops and stockpiles of raw materials. Among the main commodities produced were sheep's wool textiles and dairy products, along with the Mesopotamian staples of bread and beer. The standardized unadorned beveled rim bowls were used for dispensing grain rations to the workers. The remaining new forms were linked to accounting. Cylinder seals were oblong cylindrical pieces of stone engraved with patterns or pictorial scenes, which appear in slight relief when rolled over a damp clay surface. They were mainly used to identify the owners of goods. But the primary bureaucratic tool of the period was the storage of information on tablets, or put another way, the invention of writing. Wedge-shaped pictograms of common objects, like sheaves of grain, were inscribed in clay using a pointed stick called a stylus, a process termed cuneiform writing. Per Amanda H. Podani, tablets recorded a mountain of details for various economic transactions, including names, professions, locations, receipts, tallies, allocations of goods and rations, projections of yield, expenditure of labor, and measures of distance traveled. These temple factories, as well as the agricultural workers and the work crews needed to dig and maintain the critical web of irrigation canals, were all likely overseen by priests. Van Mierup notes that the temple's function as collector and distributor of agricultural resources was aligned with the ideology that the god received them as gifts and redistributed them to the people. The head of the temple administration served as leader of the city, which is why this is known as the era of the quote-unquote priest king. We know from objects like the Warka vase that priests were considered preeminent citizens and direct intermediaries with the gods, so they're clearly a major part of the story. But there's also another interesting aspect based on the period architecture. Per lake, most new construction in Uruk's Ayana district reflects an inventive intensity, with new structures being continuously put up, pulled down, and built again, frequently employing new methods, new materials, and new forms of decoration. One popular motif was the cone mosaic, mosaics created using colorful cone-shaped pegs. Another notable aspect of period construction is the incorporation of well-planned, open public spaces designed for maximum accessibility and permeability, with great care being taken to ensure easy circulation. She proposes the architecture may suggest a communal and egalitarian orientation in Uruk society, as does the similar transparency of early Greek civic architecture. This dovetails nicely with a similar discussion by David Graeber and David Wengrow. They describe Uruk's Great Court as an enormous sunken plaza, 165 feet across, entirely surrounded by 2 tiers of benches, and equipped with water channels to feed trees and gardens, offering much-needed shade for open-air gatherings. They continue that this sort of arrangement, a series of magnificent open temples, accompanied by a congenial space for public meetings, exactly what one might expect were Uruk to have been governed by a popular assembly. Obviously, none of these developments emerged fully formed at the start of the 4th millennium. They developed gradually over centuries. And there's another fairly important factor that we need to bring to play: the Sumerians. That's right, they're not here yet, or maybe they are. The thing is, we don't really know. Kramer proposes that the Sumerians probably arrived in the region around 3500 BC. If later literary works are any guide, their original homeland was located somewhere near a city called Arata. We have no idea where Arata was. I've seen scholars located everywhere from the Caspian Sea to Western India to Central Asia. There's also an early Sumerian work about the paradise land of Dilmun, modern Bahrain in the Persian Gulf, which makes that another possibility. And just to mention it, the term Sumerian or Shumeru is actually an Akkadian term. The Sumerians called themselves the Sag-Gig, or black-headed people. They also called the land Kengir, country of the noble lords, and their language Emagir. So exactly when, in what ways, to what extent did the Sumerians begin to impact developments? It's almost impossible to say. We can only say this: it was the Sumerians who grabbed a hold of early cuneiform, wrestled it into a cohesive writing system, then honed it into an effective tool to deploy for a variety of uses. Praising the gods, and later their own kings, recording their myths, as well as actual events, even conducting interstate diplomacy. Largely as a result, the Sumerian language and Sumerian culture came to dominate southern Mesopotamia, which is why the region is known as Sumer. It's also around 3500 BC that something mysterious transpired. Cultural artifacts linked to Uruk, pottery, architecture, even urban planning, begin appearing widely across the Near East. From the highlands of Iran to the northern reaches of the Tigris and Euphrates in Syria and Anatolia. And a fun side note for fans of my last series, the northernmost affected site was Arslan Tepe, also known as Malachia, and the westernmost site was Carchemish. Whatever prompted it, the peoples of Uruk and the surrounding region had begun to establish colonies in neighboring lands, an event called the Uruk expansion. The main driver was likely gaining access to valuable resources that were available in the south, like stone, wood, and metal. And soon enough, a new metal alloy of copper and arsenic called bronze. While some colonies were established on virgin soil, others established within or adjacent to existing settlements. As far as we can tell, colonization was not accompanied by violent military conquest, and there's no evidence of weapons, fortification, or telltale destruction. But that doesn't mean it wasn't intrusive or threatening. Everywhere they settled, the Uruk colonists brought along not just their families, goods, and possessions, but also their entire way of life. The major imports were urbanization, intensified agriculture, and the redistributive temple economy, which is already a pretty sizable package. But of course, they also brought their customs, dress, food and drink, languages, and a whole new pantheon of gods. The results, unsurprisingly, were a pretty mixed bag. In some locations, the Uruk package adopted whole cloth. In others, it barely scratched the surface. For Vandamiru, local elites at Arslan Tepe on the upper Euphrates were inspired to imitate southern practices and constructed a massive new monumental building. By contrast, at the ancient settlement of Tepe-Gawra on the upper Tigris, Sumerian influence was completely absent. The expansion was facilitated by a brand new cutting-edge technology, the two-wheeled ox-drawn cart. Centuries earlier, the experience of harnessing oxen to plow fields had led to the use of ox-drawn sledges, basically a cart on two extended runners. Mesopotamian craftsmen had also learned that round ceramics could best be made by spinning the clay on a pottery wheel, Patrick Swayze and Demi Moore style. Around 3500 BC, someone put these technologies together, replacing the runners on an ox-drawn sledge with a wheel and axle combination. The technology became so instantly popular and immediately spread so far so fast that it's almost impossible to determine where it first originated. And I do mean far, from Eastern Europe to the Northern Steppe, right down to the Persian Gulf. It may be coincidence that the same century that first saw widespread use of the two-wheeled cart and the four-wheeled wagon also saw the Uruk expansion, but it seems more likely that there was at least some kind of synergy. For reasons as mysterious as those that caused it, the Uruk expansion collapsed around 3100 BC. Like a wave receding from a distant shore, far-flung Sumerian outposts were abandoned, with the colonists returning to southern Mesopotamia. It's possible they were driven off by new migrations from the north and east. It's also possible that these migrations only followed Sumerian retrenchment. The southern Mesopotamia to which they returned was in the throes of some serious expansion. Cities and temples were growing, increasing farmland was being irrigated and worked, and the population was generally booming. The heavyweight champ was our old friend Uruk, with a population of roughly 40,000. But it had a few major competitors: Eridu, Ur, Lagash, Nippur, and particularly Kish to the north. It was also primed for some major change. Per Vandamiru, the monumental buildings that dominated the Ana complex in Uruk, the citizen-friendly architecture we talked about earlier, were razed, and the entire area was leveled to make way for new construction. Despite abandoning their distant colonies, this was the period when Sumerian culture expanded into nearby regions, particularly the Diyala River Valley. But, there's expansion along the periphery, and there's expansion within a tightly drained area. The latter often resulted in the agricultural hinterland of two growing city-states converging along a common frontier, which could be a time for fruitful collaboration or a time of outrageous violence. We'll hold things here for now, around 2900 BC, at the cusp of what's come to be known as the Early Dynastic period. Next episode, we'll pull one thread we mentioned earlier. If the Uruk collapse had in fact been prompted by new migrations from the north and east, just who were the incoming migrants? It's time to discuss the culture that had defined much of the northern region between the Caucasus Mountains and northern Syria for the next few thousand years. A culture called the Kura Araxes, more commonly known as the Hurrians. Would you like to listen to ad-free episodes of The Ancient World and a bunch of other great history podcasts? Then to The Ancient World podcast on Apple Podcasts and subscribe to Airwave History Plus. You'll get a free 7-day trial to listen to ad-free episodes, bonus content, and more from the largest collection of history podcasts anywhere. So subscribe to Airwave History Plus on Apple Podcasts today.